Bishop Strickland posted this yesterday with, again, LifeSite News. LifeSite News is, again, not a Catholic website. It is the media arm of this new parallel church, a church of dissent against the true Catholic Church, a church that, or a community that is promoting a false parallel church that is undermining the one true Church of Christ, but still claiming to be Catholic and pulling the wool over people's eyes. That's what LifeSite News is. Well, Strickland goes with LifeSite News and says the Vatican is more interested in silencing Archbishop Vigano than addressing his allegations. I thought that's weird in light of some things I've seen Strickland say going back the last few years that I'm about to show to you. And also in light of the fact that in 2020, the Vatican came out with the full report on McCarrick, giving us the who, what, when, where, why, who knew what, when, where, and how, and everything, giving us receipts on everything. 461-page report. And in that report, I just did a video on it less than a month ago. I put a link to it in the show notes. It's a 3.5-hour video. I go over every detail showing you how there are a lot of problems with Vigano and his relationship to Cardinal McCarrick, the accused abuser, who was laicized by Pope Francis. And I show Vigano failed to rein McCarrick in, knowing about McCarrick, failed to rein him in and do things about him when he had several chances and opportunities, and failed to follow the instructions that the Vatican gave him in 2012 about a priest who claimed he was abused by McCarrick. He barely did anything about it, and it was not what the Vatican told him to do, so he did not sufficiently address that issue. And that then meant that the situation with McCarrick was delayed, and he wasn't disciplined as quickly as he could have been. It's all spelled out in that 2020 document that's available online for free for everyone to read. But if you don't want to read it, I did a video condensing it for you. You might say, well, that's really long. But you know what? This is a really important issue, and there's a lot of ground to cover. And there's a lot that Vigano had in relation to McCarrick that, you know, I needed to put in that video. And so that's why it's 3.5 hours, because there was a lot going on there. Unfortunately, I haven't seen Bishop Strickland address that. So for him to bring up the Vigano and McCarrick issue makes me scratch my head, because this has been out 4 years. But it gets even more concerning when we consider everything that Strickland has said from before the McCarrick report in 2020 and after the McCarrick report, right after it was released, unto yesterday on the screenshot that I just showed you. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what Strickland has said. Obviously not something exhaustive, but something quick that shows you the substance of what he has said about this. And this is where it gets even more troubling. So again, he says with, again, this fake Catholic, non-Catholic website, LifeSite News, Vigano announces, here it is. Bishop Strickland, the Vatican is more interested in silencing Vigano than addressing his allegations. Okay, now that's weird in light of this video. Now, this was done right before that McCarrick report. This was January 21 of 2020. Now, the McCarrick report came out in November 10th of 2020. So this was at the beginning of 2020. The report comes out later. So this is before the report came out. Bishop Strickland meets with Pope Francis face-to-face and asks him about the McCarrick report. Watch what he says.
I did ask him about the McCarrick situation, and I can say he did give some perspective. He broadened my understanding of the whole issue, and it was very helpful.
That's not the end. We're going to watch more, but just a pause. Take that in. Meets with the Pope, expresses his concerns about the McCarrick report. Now, I'll remind you, prior to this, he said he read Vigano's claims about Pope Francis covering for McCarrick, and he finds those claims to be credible. That's what Strickland said at the time. So he then goes and asks Pope Francis about it. And he says Pope Francis kind of put him at ease, brought in his perspective. It was a really great meeting. Now, see, this is not something he says anymore, though, right? He doesn't say that anymore. But at the time, he was saying this when he met with Pope Francis. But let's keep going.
Bishop Strickland drew widespread attention in August 2018 for a public statement saying he found credible the allegations made by retired Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, the former.
He tells that to his flock. I find him credible. This is when he was still a bishop of a diocese, the Bishop of Tyler. Then he goes and meets with Pope Francis. He feels like Pope Francis answered his question sufficiently, put him at ease, broadened his horizon. Now, all of a sudden, when he's no longer bishop and Pope Francis removes him, then we start to see Strickland amping up on the claims of, oh, they're not addressing the McCarrick allegations. And you're seeing him saying stuff like, well, they're not addressing his allegations and they're trying to silence Vigano. Aside from the fact that they're not silencing Vigano, Vigano literally says he's not in communion with Pope Francis. So they're just recognizing he's already excommunicated himself. But aside from that, we see a shift after he was removed from ministry. Before, it's like, okay, Pope Francis answered things. I feel better now. But after he removes him from ministry, it's like, you know what? This whole thing that happened 4 years ago, that wasn't actually addressed. It gets worse, though. Watch.
Former nuncio to the United States, who alleged that top Vatican officials, including Pope Francis, knew that then Cardinal Theodore E. McCarrick had been accused of sexual misconduct.
My message was, it does need to be dealt with. I would love to have seen it totally disproven, which I think it hasn't been. I mean, there definitely were elements there, possibly Archbishop Vigano went overboard on some issues. I mean, he's just a man also. Archbishop Vigano said Pope Francis should resign. I never intended to embrace that because, I mean, that's a major thing to say. I don't know if Archbishop Vigano still stands by that or not. I certainly didn't want to validate that, but
So what are we hearing so far? To recap, we're hearing, okay, well, I find these claims about Pope Francis to be credible, then goes and meets with Pope Francis. He brought in my horizon, gave me some things to think about I didn't think about, made me feel good, answered all my questions. There's some things that haven't been disproven, some things that Vigano said that haven't been disproven, but I'm not on board with everything that Vigano said, like calling for Pope Francis's resignation. That's what we're hearing so far.
I said, these allegations about McCarrick need to be investigated. And
okay, so he's calling for an investigation, and he, of course, got that investigation.
they have been.
Catholic News Service asked Bishop Strickland if he thought Pope Francis had known about the allegations against McCarrick since 2013, as Archbishop Vigano claimed.
Honestly, I'd have to say I don't know. And speaking again of nuance and looking at the real context of things, because some of the things that Pope Francis said makes you realize it's always a bigger picture than maybe the slice that you're looking at. He did indicate a broader context that, is challenging for all of us. So I certainly am not ready to judge the actions in the moment of any of the pontiffs.
So did Pope Francis know that he was an abuser? He's saying, well, I don't know. I'm not ready to judge him. He gave me a lot to think about, broadened my horizon, blah, 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 blah. Now, McCarrick report drops, because that was, again, all said before the McCarrick report dropped. Then the McCarrick report dropped. This is November 16th of 2020. Again, 6 days after the McCarrick report was released. Bishop Strickland of Tyler, Texas, said the recently released report on former Cardinal McCarrick, describing his ascent to the highest rungs of the church, even amid rumors of abuse, Read like a list of 7 deadly sins: lust, greed, gluttony, wrath, sloth, envy, pride. Pretty much the report covers all of them. Now, a person who says, hey, the report covers all this, let me ask you a question. If somebody told you, hey, the report covers all this, is that a person who is implying they read the report? Or at the very least, they're familiar with the contents of the report. Maybe somebody read it to them, right? You would think, right? So all of that information I've shown to you on that 3.5-hour video where I go over pages 374 to like 380 something, especially that area that talks about Priest 3's allegations against McCarrick and Vigano not handling that situation well. All that prior stuff where I'm showing you Vigano is going to places with McCarrick, knowing the stuff about McCarrick, knowing the claims that were made about him and that he himself made about him in 2006 and 2008. Knowing all that stuff, he's going to public places with them. He's just partying and laughing it up, and they're talking theology, and he's giving them public praises. Vigano's publicly praising McCarrick. McCarrick's asking him, hey, should I maybe stop going to places and stop being so visible? Vigano doesn't tell him no, doesn't stop him, never confronts him about Priest 3's allegations against McCarrick, doesn't follow the instructions, all of the instructions that were given to him by Cardinal Wale. I go over all of that. And again, to the end of him being nuncio, never confronted McCarrick. Vigano never confronted him. So Strickland knows all this, right? You can't say, well, he didn't read it. Well, here he's saying, here's what the report reads like. Here's the problem with the report. It's a confirmation of all the deadly sins, and we haven't finished all of his comments yet. But a person who says this is a person who's read it then. So I have to assume Strickland has read that 2020 McCarrick report. I have to assume that if he's going to comment on it. Otherwise, don't comment on something you haven't read. Right? So I got to assume he's read it. So that means he knows all this stuff about Vigano. So that means whenever he's saying that the Vatican hasn't really addressed the allegations of McCarrick, he should know better than that. That also means the fact that he doesn't call Vigano out for his failure to rein in McCarrick and follow up with Priest 3's allegation to the extent that Wale instructed him. The fact he doesn't call him to repentance on that is troubling. I mean, aside from the fact that it's really troubling that Strickland isn't calling Vigano to repentance for his excommunication and schism. That's weird, right? Especially when Strickland and others want to say, well, fiducia isn't calling same-sex attracted people who are acting on that to repentance. Well, you guys aren't calling schismatics to repentance. Even though, again, I don't agree with that claim about fiducia. Even if that were true, they're not calling schismatics to repentance. So you got to start with yourself. You got to call sinners yourself to repentance, and then we can talk about others. But again, putting that to the side, watch what else he says in that interview, November 16, 2020. He says, the report covers all of these sins. He said this during the more than half hour of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, allowed the prelates November 16 to discuss the report released by Vatican November 10th. The bishops all got together to discuss it. It was the first time the U.S. prelates as a group discussed the findings of the investigation of one of its own after the long-awaited release. The session was part of the first day of the U.S. Bishops' annual Fall General Assembly held online November 16 and 17 this year because of the pandemic. Now watch what Strickland says, quote, I think we need to really, as pastors, acknowledge that we're all sinners and we're all called away from sin. But the report shows sometimes pastors and others can turn a blind eye to sin, Strickland said. I think that could be the title of the report. Now, that's weird. So Strickland is saying, hey, the title of the report needs to be, we're turning a blind eye to sin. Meanwhile, to my knowledge, Strickland is not addressing Vigano's involvement with McCarrick. Is that turning a blind eye to sin? Some would say yes. Some would say yes. if I'm missing something, if Strickland has called Vigano out for his failure to address Priest 3 to the extent that Wale called him to, and all of the other issues surrounding Vigano and McCarrick failing to rein in McCarrick, seemingly turning a blind eye in some instances to McCarrick, you would think, again, Strickland would know this information because he evidently read the report. He talks about its content, so he would know this. Some would say, well, does this mean that they're turning a blind eye to what Vigano did here? Because, again, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of Bishop Strickland calling this out with Vigano. There's an implied support for Vigano here, an indictment on the Vatican on his part, claiming that the Vatican has not actually addressed his allegations when, again, in reality, the church has done more than address the allegations that Vigano brought up concerning McCarrick. 461 pages. How much more do you need? What else would that be? And again, he said this yesterday, 4 years after the report that he allegedly read. But what's not being addressed by Strickland and others, unfortunately, is Vigano's involvement with McCarrick. Now, I'm not saying Vigano is solely responsible for everything with McCarrick and Vigano didn't do anything in any circumstance. No, that's not what I'm saying. If you go and watch the video, I show you what he did do in some cases and didn't do in others. But it's the didn't do in others stuff that was incredibly negligent and problematic, and Vigano has yet to address this in any kind of sufficient way. Everything he said so far about the allegations against him, he just basically dismissed it, makes a comment here and there that really is absolutely irrelevant to the claims addressed against him, and moves on. That's inadequate. And that's not holding Vigano to accountability. Something the Bishop Strickland says he wants accountability for the people involved with McCarrick. Well, where's that accountability call when it comes to the people that we said were credible? It all of a sudden stops then. We don't want to hold them accountable, it would seem. That's the impression that I'm getting. Well, the article continues. In 460 pages, the report showed how laity, seminarians, and even prelates over decades made an effort to call attention to the church's hierarchy to, in writing and sometimes verbally, incidences of abuse on part of McCarrick. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. You can go and check it out. But here Strickland says it's very clear that there's still very much a tendency in the world and in the church to turn a blind eye to many of these sins. I agree with that. I agree with Bishop Strickland. I also would add to what Bishop Strickland says, there's also a tendency to turn a blind eye to some of the people that we've given our approval for that we should have never approved. There is a tendency to turn a blind eye. Maybe we want to turn a blind eye to Vigano's involvement with McCarrick. Maybe there's a tendency to do that. It doesn't stop there. Plot thickens. This is from December 9th of 2020. So again, this is after the McCarrick report has been released that Strickland, I have to assume, read because he's commenting on the contents of it. Bishop Strickland, McCarrick report reveals web of corruption. Again, now if a guy is telling you, hey, the report reveals a web of corruption, that means you've read it, right? And that then means that you're aware of Vigano's involvement in that web of corruption, right? Where's the comments about that, though? He stated that although the McCarrick report may have answered some questions and concerns, it did not give real accountability for the scandal. Now, I just have some questions. It's 461 pages filled with details of everything. Who, what, when, where, why, what, how. Receipts everywhere. I thought that it does show where the accountability is. I think it does show where the responsibility is in relation to McCarrick. I think it does address that. What more? What else do you want it to address? what other aspects of accountability need to be addressed? Honest question. And then if we're going to speak of accountability for the scandal, what about accountability for Vigano and his involvement in that scandal? Where's the accountability there? I also have to ask, why is Bishop Strickland still promoting, in at least to an extent, and defending at least to an extent, Bishop Vigano, in light of that, the contents of that report showing his involvement? And number two, why is he defending, at least to an extent, a bishop who doesn't think that Bishop Strickland is a bishop? In Vigano's mind, Bishop Strickland is not a bishop, unless Bishop Strickland has also been recently reordained by Bishop Williamson or someone else, which to my knowledge he hasn't been, so I don't believe he has. Unless that happened, Vigano doesn't think that Strickland is a bishop. All of Strickland's sacraments, all of his masses are invalid. Strickland has never probably received a valid Eucharist in Vigano's mind, if what Vigano is saying is true. Because again, you have to remember, Vigano is saying Vatican II is invalid, no authority behind it. That then means the new rite of ordination since the Second Vatican Council is invalid. That means almost every bishop in the world today is an invalid bishop. Almost every priest is an invalid priest. Almost every mass is an invalid mass. Almost every confession is an invalid confession. Almost every confirmation is an invalid confirmation. Many marriages are invalid. That would then mean Bishop Strickland isn't a bishop if this is true. Why defend a guy who thinks that about you? Why do this? Over and against the Pope, the papacy? It's wild. If what Vigano is saying is true, that means Bishop Strickland has never been a bishop. Why continue to support this guy? Why continue to back him up? Vigano's creating a parallel church, as I just showed y'all. Well, why continue to offer support for this guy? He's creating a parallel church. So I want to know, why isn't Strickland calling him to repentance? Why doesn't he call him to repentance for his involvement with McCarrick? Why doesn't he call Vigano to repentance for his creation of a parallel church and sending priests into the territory of other bishops? Why isn't he calling Vigano to repentance for schism, for false teachings, for wildly slanderous claims about the successor of St. Peter, for false teachings about Vatican II and the denial of Vatican II, and now for a denial of the authority of all the popes since Vatican II, including John Paul II, Benedict, Francis, and so on. Paul VI, John 23rd, denying all of those. Why doesn't Strickland call him to repentance on that? Instead, what we hear is, well, you know what? Vigano's claims weren't sufficiently addressed by the Vatican. That ain't gonna work. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see the full video, go to the link in the description. And also, while you're at it, hit the subscribe button. God bless. For years, I've tirelessly defended the Catholic magisterium, despite pushback from numerous people slandering this ministry, misrepresenting it, and calling for its cancellation. Our situation today is very similar to the days of St. Maximus the Confessor, who was constantly pressured to deviate from the teachings of Rome and embrace the heresies that many other bishops were promoting. He was exiled, ridiculed, slandered, but he stood fast despite this persecution, which also included the imperial court of Constantinople cutting off his arm and ripping out his tongue so that he could no longer write the truth and speak the truth. It can be costly to speak the truth and defend the papacy in an age that is so hostile towards it, just like during the days of St. Maximus. But this is what we are called to do. This is the faith and tradition of our forefathers. I plead for all Catholics to stand up for our church and defend it. And consider supporting this channel that has been vindicated by Rome's decisions time after time again. You can do that by subscribing and supporting this ministry at patreon.com/Reason and Theology or reasonandtheology.locals.com. There's also a PayPal and a GoFundMe link in the description of this video. God bless.